My mother removed me from her will because I didn't like my new father, but when I received $12 million, she demanded money from me, citing financial problems. I don't think anyone ever dreams of a childhood like mine. To me, family was supposed to mean safety, love, and warmth, but those were things I only saw on TV or heard other kids talk about. When my mother, Linda, remarried Richard, I thought maybe things would finally get better. I was wrong. Linda was distant. I don't know if she was always that way or if it happened slowly over time, but by the time I was old enough to notice, she was more like a roommate who drifted in and out of my life than an actual mom. She was constantly busy, always fussing over the house, or more likely, over Richard and his son, Brian, who to her could do no wrong. It felt like I was the extra in a play where I was meant to be the main character, but instead, I was the outsider, the one person who never quite fit from the start. Richard didn't try to hide his feelings about me. He acted like my very existence was a problem he had to deal with, and not in some subtle, I'm the man of the house way. No, he was obvious, loud, and relentless about it. There was disgust in his eyes whenever he looked at me, like I had interrupted his perfect life just by being around. He wasn't shy about his opinions either. Every little thing I did was wrong, and he made sure I knew it. "Jessica, why can't you be more like Brian?" He'd sneer, crossing his arms and shaking his head at me over the dinner table, where every meal was a test I seemed to fail. Brian, of course, was the golden child. He was Richard's son from his first marriage, and though he was just a year older than me, he had this quiet confidence that made everyone love him, or at least that's how it seemed to me. Brian wasn't outright mean to me, but he didn't make it easier either. He watched me the way his dad did, with smug indifference, like he knew I'd never be part of their world. I felt so alone in that house. My mom, Linda, seemed to lose her voice whenever Richard was around. She'd smile and nod at him, her eyes soft with this strange mixture of adoration and fear. It was like she'd forgotten I existed most of the time, only acknowledging me when Richard or Brian wasn't around. The few times I did ask her why she let Richard treat me the way he did, her responses were evasive, like she was too tired to even think about it. "Jessica, he's just strict. He wants the best for you," she'd say in that empty tone, not even looking at me as she spoke. I stopped asking her after a while. But it wasn't just words. Richard wasn't afraid to make sure I stayed in my place. I remember one time I'd come home from school with a report card that wasn't perfect, mostly B's with a couple of A's. I thought I'd done well, considering how I had to sneak in study time with all the chores Richard assigned me. But as soon as I handed it to him, I knew it wouldn't be enough to. This is what you call effort," he snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. He crumpled the paper in his hand, throwing it back at me. "Jessica, why can't you be like Brian? Do you see this?" He pulled out Brian's report card from the table drawer, showing off a perfect row of A's as if it were a piece of art. I wanted to yell, to tell him how unfair he was being, how much harder it was for me. But when I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat, and all that came out was a weak, "I'm trying." He shook his head and muttered, "Try harder," before ordering me off to my room. And Linda? She just watched. She always just watched, a small, sad smile on her face, as if she were sorry but too afraid to say anything. I'd sit in my room, sometimes for hours, just staring at the walls, feeling like I was sinking into the floorboards. Those walls were the only things that heard my voice, the only things that seemed to hold my pain. They didn't judge, they didn't ignore, and they didn't make me feel like I was a mistake. There comes a point when you just can't take anymore. And for me, that moment came one night after an argument that left me shaking. I was 17 weeks away from graduation, and I'd stayed up late finishing a school project. Richard had stumbled in late from some work gathering, reeking of alcohol. He took one look at me, slouched over my books at the kitchen table, and sneered. "What? You think you're going to get somewhere with that nonsense? Who do you think you are?" Something inside me snapped that night. I didn't even respond. I just went to my room, shut the door, and sat there in the darkness, my head buzzing with one thought. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house before it swallowed me whole. The next morning, I walked to school feeling different, like a door had opened that I hadn't noticed before. My best friend, Sarah, noticed it too. Sarah was a quiet, steady presence in my life. Someone who didn't pry, but was always there when I needed her. She'd known about my family situation for years, and while I'd never told her everything, she understood enough. That morning, she looked at me with a mixture of worry and relief when I told her, "I'm leaving. I can't stay there anymore." Sarah nodded, not saying a word, just holding my hand. It felt like the first time someone had truly been on my side. That evening, I packed a bag with a few clothes, some cash I'd saved from tutoring sessions, and my favorite books. Pieces of comfort I wasn't willing to leave behind. I didn't tell Linda or Richard. I didn't want their voices in my head, didn't want them dragging me down just as I was getting up the courage to break free. But, of course, things weren't that simple. Linda noticed the bag the moment she saw me in the hallway. She stood there, her gaze flicking between my face and the duffel bag, as if trying to process what was happening. Jessica, what are you doing? Her voice was thin, wavering, but not with the fear I'd expected. There was a strange calmness, as if she'd known this was coming. I'm leaving, Mom. I can't live here anymore. The words came out stronger than I'd imagined, a force I didn't know I had in me. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. Then she laughed a soft, bitter sound. And where do you think you'll go? You don't have anything. This world isn't kind to girls like you. I'd rather face whatever's out there than stay here, I said, not backing down. She sighed, shaking her head as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. You'll be back, she muttered, turning away. I slipped out before Richard came home, the weight of her words trailing behind me. I didn't know what would happen, where I'd go, or who I'd turn to, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The first few nights, I crashed on Sarah's couch. Her family knew me well enough, and her mom offered to let me stay for as long as I needed. It was tempting, but I didn't want to burden them. I needed to stand on my own. One afternoon, as I was scanning job boards at the local library, I met someone who would change everything. Her name was Marissa, a bright-eyed woman in her early 30s who ran a local coffee shop. She noticed me staring at the job postings on the community board and came over, handing me a flyer. We're looking for help at the shop. Interested? I looked down at the flyer. The words barista needed stared back at me. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I nodded, and by the end of the week, I was clocking in for my first shift. Marissa quickly became more than just a boss. She was like the sister I'd never had, a mentor who seemed to understand what I was going through without me saying a word. She'd been through her own battles, and there was a strength in her that I admired deeply. She'd give me extra shifts when I needed them, slip me a sandwich when she thought I looked tired, and once, when she caught me crying in the break room, she just sat with me, her hand on my shoulder. Living independently was harder than I'd imagined. Rent, food, and bills piled up, and I found myself stretching every dollar. But for the first time, I felt like my life was mine, not a puppet show controlled by Richard and Linda. Every time I felt like giving up, I'd think about them and remember why I'd left. The thought of going back kept me going. One day, out of nowhere, Linda showed up at the coffee shop. She looked out of place among the cheerful decor and the smell of fresh coffee, her face tense and drawn. Marissa was at the counter, and I was in the back when she called me over. Jess, someone's here to see you, she said, her voice careful, as if she could sense the tension. I walked out, my heart pounding. There, standing in front of the counter, was Linda. She looked at me with those same sad eyes. But this time, there was something else in her expression. Guilt, maybe? Regret? She took a deep breath before speaking. I've been thinking, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong. About everything. I treated you so badly, and I can't take it back. But maybe we can start over. The words hit me like a punch. I looked at her for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. Everything inside me screamed to walk away, to keep moving forward. I didn't know her anything. But then I remembered something. I didn't need her approval to move on. I could forgive her for me, not for her. I don't know if we can start over, I said quietly, shaking my head. But I've already started my own life. She nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand, she whispered. And just like that, she left. It was the last time I ever saw her. I realized in that moment that I didn't need their approval to be happy. I could create a life for myself, one that wasn't defined by their cruelty or their expectations. It took a long time to believe it, but I did, and I'd never go back.